The summer heat beyond Laramie had a way of pushing honest folks toward desperate choices. By midday, the prairie grass lay scorched and flattened under a Wyoming sun that showed no mercy. Even the breeze seemed to have surrendered. Elias Croft had lived through enough frontier summers to smell danger long before it knocked on his door. At 64, he'd lowered too many good men into the earth to mistake trouble for anything else. Most of his years, he'd been smart enough to sidestep it. That was likely the reason he was still breathing when so many others weren't. All Elias wanted was to make it home before nightfall with a sack of cornmeal, tobacco, and lantern oil. Simple enough. But instead, he caught sight of a young woman moving through the tall grass beside the wagon trail on her hands and knees. His first thought was heatstroke or whiskey. Then he spotted the blood soaking through her stocking. The wound wasn't fatal. A bullet had cut across her lower leg without burying itself, but every movement she made sent visible pain rippling through her body. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Her pale dress was caked in sweat and trail dust. Dark hair fell across her face as she clawed herself forward inch by inch. And gripped in her trembling right hand was a small pearl-handled Remington pocket pistol. Elias stepped down from his wagon with the careful slowness of a man whose joints had opinions about everything. The girl snapped her head up and thrust the little gun toward him. Her hands shook too badly to hold a steady aim. "Don't come any closer," she breathed. Elias studied her for a moment. She wasn't pointing that pistol because she wanted blood. She was pointing it because she was terrified of what might happen if she didn't. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats somewhere past the ridge. 2 riders, possibly 3, moving fast and deliberate. The old rancher's eyes swept the landscape and landed on a dry creek bed roughly 40 yards ahead. That was their only option. If those riders crested the hill and spotted her lying exposed in the open grass, the conversation was over. "You have to move right now," Elias said. The girl pushed herself forward and immediately buckled. A sharp cry escaped her before she could stop it. Her cheeks were streaked with both tears and dust. "I can't," she gasped. Elias glanced back toward the ridge. Too close now. No time left for careful decisions. He dropped down beside her with a grunt that cost him more dignity than he liked and pressed one weathered hand gently against her back. "Keep crawling," he said. "I'll watch behind us." She dragged herself through the dead grass while pain tore through her with every movement. The little pistol rattled in her grip. Then she turned and looked back at him with an expression that hit him somewhere deep. "Don't make me become something I'm not." Elias recognized that look. Not panic, not weakness. It was the face of someone teetering, on the edge of a version of themselves they could never walk back from. The riders appeared above the grass line. Elias pulled his old Colt and fired once toward a rusted bucket dangling from a broken fence rail 30 yards off. The crack split the air like lightning. One of the horses spooked hard, nearly throwing its rider sideways. It bought them perhaps 15 seconds. He pushed the girl onward through the dirt and dry grass until they tumbled into the creek bed together. By the time he dragged her inside a collapsed shack nearby, his lungs were working harder than they had any right to. The girl turned to speak. But before a single word left her mouth, Elias Croft staggered sideways like a man whose strings had been cut and crashed face first onto the rotted floorboards. Outside, hoofbeats grew slowly louder, and Nora Dalton suddenly understood the most terrifying thing imaginable. The only soul willing to pull her out of that grass might have just spent everything he had doing it. For a long and terrible moment, Nora believed the old man was gone. Elias Croft didn't move. The shack smelled of dry rot, old leather, and months of Wyoming heat baked into the walls. Beyond the cracked boards, hoofbeats drifted somewhere through the grass. Close enough to hear, not close enough yet to run from. Nora dropped beside him and rolled him carefully onto his back. His face was ash-pale beneath the grime. She unhooked the canteen from his belt, soaked a cloth she found nearby, and pressed it against his forehead. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Nothing." Then a cough tore out of him so hard it rattled the boards beneath him. Nora nearly collapsed with relief. Elias cracked one eye open halfway and squinted up at her. "You always hover this close over strangers?" he muttered. "Only the ones foolish enough to fall over in the middle of a rescue," she answered. The old man almost smiled. Even half collapsed on a rotten floor, he still had enough left in him for sarcasm. Somehow that made her trust him more than anything else could have. Elias pulled himself slowly upright against the wall, breathing in short, careful pulls. Up close, Nora could read the whole story of his life written across his face. The deep lines carved by decades of wind and worry. One shoulder sitting lower than the other from some old break that never healed quite right. Hands that looked like they'd repaired 10,000 things that nobody ever acknowledged. "You should have left me out there in that grass," Nora said quietly. Elias shook his head once without hesitation. No man worth a damn walks past a wounded girl. Then his expression sharpened. "Now tell me exactly who's riding after you and why." So she did. She told him everything about her father's ranch south of Laramie and the underground spring running across its southern pasture. Water in Wyoming was worth more than gold and twice as dangerous. She told him about Sheriff's Deputy Cole Briggs collecting payments from cattle barons who wanted the Dalton property wiped off every map in the territory. And she told him about the small ledger hidden beneath her coat lining. Elias went very still when she mentioned the ledger. That book held names, dates, dollar amounts, and witnessed signatures. Enough to end a career. Enough to end a man. And if Deputy Briggs understood that ledger had gone missing, Nora's father wouldn't survive to see another morning. "My papa never stole a single thing in his life," Nora said. "They know that. They just don't care." Elias believed her before he finished the thought. Maybe because men like Briggs weren't strangers to him. He'd watched that particular breed shake hands in church on Sunday and ruin families by Wednesday for 30 years. The old rancher rubbed his jaw slowly. At his age, walking into somebody else's trouble was a good way to never walk out of it. He'd already done more than most men half his years would have managed. He should have been thinking about his own cattle and his own quiet porch. Instead, he tilted his head toward the small smeared window and listened. Then he exhaled slowly. "We ride for Garnet Crossing before first light," he said. Nora frowned. "The rail stop? Why?" "Telegraph office," Elias answered. "I know a federal marshal out of Cheyenne who hasn't forgotten what the law is actually supposed to do. And right here, friends, if this old Wyoming tale is holding you tonight, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now. Pour yourself something warm, settle in a little deeper, and tell me something. What time is it where you're sitting right now? What part of the world has you listening to a frontier story tonight? Because before morning came to Laramie, that worn-out old rancher was about to make either the biggest mistake of his remaining years or the finest decision of his entire life. Elias Croft had every intention of leaving before dawn. That was the sensible plan. A man 64 years old with creaking bones and a ranch that needed tending had absolutely no business riding through Wyoming darkness beside a wounded girl carrying evidence against a corrupt deputy. None whatsoever, and yet, somewhere past midnight, that was precisely where he found himself. He kept the wagon well off the main southern road. Deputy Briggs almost certainly had riders covering every obvious route between Laramie and Garnet Crossing. Nora sat beside him in the pale moonlight, one hand pressed quietly against her injured leg, pretending the pain wasn't written plainly across her face. Elias noticed anyway. "You're allowed to say it hurts," he told her. She gave him a flat look. "You're allowed to admit you're exhausted," he almost laughed. The fear sitting between them eased just slightly, just enough to feel human again, but neither of them let their guard drop for long. Near dawn, Elias spotted wood smoke lifting above an abandoned stage relay station beside the trail. At first glance, it looked like a traveler stopping for warmth. Then he noticed the horse tracks pressed fresh into the dirt. 3 riders, less than an hour old. He pulled the wagon behind a collapsed outbuilding and climbed down slowly. Both knees announced themselves. "Heavens above," Nora murmured. "Do your bones do that every morning?" "Only before I've had coffee," he said. She almost managed to laugh. Then both of them heard the hoofbeats. 3 riders came over the rise fast. The man out front, a broad-shouldered figure with a flat expression that suggested he hadn't smiled at anything in years, pulled up his horse and looked directly at them. "Girl travels with a price on her head," the man called out. "Old man's just old." Elias pushed Nora behind an overturned water trough. Then the shooting started. Splinters exploded from the boards above them. Elias fired once from behind a wagon wheel and sent one rider tumbling from his saddle. A second man came at him low with a blade. The old rancher twisted away barely in time. stumbled, then brought the barrel of his Colt across the man's jaw hard enough to drop him into the dust. But the leader was something different. Younger, broader, faster. A single punch sent Elias crashing against the trough beside Nora so hard his vision fractured for a moment. He stayed down, trying to find enough air to stand again. Nora raised the small pearl-handled pistol with both trembling hands and aimed it directly at the man's chest. He stopped, looked at her, then smiled the way cold iron smiles. "Go on then," he said. But Nora couldn't pull the trigger. And somehow, watching that, Elias understood her more completely than hours of conversation had managed. The man's eyes dropped to the ledger peeking from inside her coat. And Elias felt his stomach turn over. He wasn't chasing Nora anymore. He was chasing that book. More gunfire cracked from behind the building. A bullet skimmed the top of the trough so close Nora felt the air move against her hair. That broke the moment apart instantly. Elias grabbed her arm. "Wagon! Now!" He climbed onto the seat with considerably more difficulty than he intended to show. Everything hurt in ways he didn't have names for anymore. Ribs, shoulder, the simple act of breathing. But he slapped the reins and pushed the horses forward through the dry Wyoming earth, while behind them the riders fanned out across the flats. He knew exactly what that spreading formation meant. They weren't trying for a quick ending. They were trying to cut off every direction. That was the more dangerous approach. The road to Garnet Crossing stretched ahead through rolling open grassland with nowhere to hide and no mercy in the landscape whatsoever. Around midday, Nora noticed the dark stain spreading through Elias's shirt near his upper arm. A bullet had found him somewhere in the chaos at the stage stop. "You need a doctor," she said. Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Nearest thing to a proper doctor in this territory usually shows up smelling like rye whiskey and carrying scissors he last cleaned in 1871. Nora laughed in spite of everything. They reached Garnet Crossing late in the afternoon. The place barely earned the word town. A handful of weathered buildings gathered around the rail line, a water tower leaning slightly east, and a telegraph office that looked like one ambitious wind would settle the matter permanently. Elias sat motionless on the wagon seat for a long moment before his body agreed to climb down, like a man negotiating with his own legs. Inside the telegraph office, the young clerk behind the counter took one look at the revolver on Elias's hip and the blood soaking through his sleeve and seemed to consider whether his wage covered situations like this. Nora pulled the ledger from inside her coat and held it carefully. Her hands were steady now, but she hesitated for just a moment, understanding in full what she was releasing. That book was the only thing keeping her father alive. It was also the reason every mile of the last 2 days had tried to kill them both. Elias looked at her quietly. "If you're waiting for life to become fair before you do what needs doing," he said, "you'll be waiting long after it matters." She looked at him for a breath. Then she placed the ledger on the counter. The clerk transmitted every name, every date, every figure to Federal Marshal Henry Greer in Cheyenne. When the final key click faded, Nora exhaled something she felt like she'd been carrying in her chest since this whole thing began. But Elias wasn't relaxed. Not even close. Old habits of survival meant he noticed small things. And right now, the thing he noticed was that the telegraph clerk had stopped making eye contact entirely. The boy kept glancing toward the window, toward the horses tied out front, toward the road running south. Elias stepped slowly onto the porch. Far down the trail, a single rider was already disappearing into the dust at full gallop, heading south toward Laramie as fast as that horse could be pushed. The old rancher's stomach dropped straight through the floorboards. Deputy Cole Briggs now knew everything. And Nora's father was sitting alone in a jail cell with a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Briggs moved before the next dawn touched Laramie. He pulled Thomas Dalton from his cell with 2 men flanking him and a covered wagon waiting in the alley behind the jailhouse. No judge, no witnesses who would speak afterward. Just darkness, silence, and a crooked lawman attempting to bury his sins before daylight could illuminate them. But Elias Croft had already figured that much out. By the time Elias, Nora, and Marshal Henry Greer rode back into Laramie, the Wyoming sky was shifting from black to the pale gray that comes just before sunrise. Nora spotted her father first. His wrists were bound and his face was drawn with exhaustion, but when he looked up and saw his daughter alive and riding toward him, something in his posture changed entirely. Like a man remembering who he was. Briggs reached for his revolver at almost the exact moment Marshal Greer called his name across the street. Everything that followed happened in the space of a few heartbeats. No time for speeches. No time for anything except instinct. Elias moved in front of Nora anyway. His legs nearly failed him before he caught himself against the wagon wheel. At 64 years old, bruised through to the bone, running on dust and stubbornness, the old rancher still stepped toward the danger rather than away from it. That tells you everything worth knowing about a man. Not how much strength he has left, but who he chooses to protect when his body has already voted to quit. Marshal Greer fired first. The shot rang clean across the empty street. Briggs's revolver spun out of his hand and clattered into the dirt beside a wagon wheel. The man who had terrorized half of Laramie County suddenly looked like exactly what he was: small, cornered, and finished. The other rider broke for his horse. Greer's men stopped him before he made it 10 steps. Then the moment ended. Truly ended. Elias lowered his old Colt with the slow deliberateness of a man laying something heavy down for the last time. His breathing came rough and uneven. Nora reached him just as his knees finally gave out completely. He went down in the dust he'd fought through an entire desperate night to cross. And I think that image is the one that stays with people long after the details fade. Not the gunfight. Not the federal marshal or the ledger full of names. Just a tired old man who could have stayed on his porch and watched someone else's trouble from a safe distance, but decided that a stranger's daughter was worth every mile of it. A few months later, Cole Briggs was tried and removed from Wyoming territory permanently. Thomas Dalton recovered his land, his water rights, and his reputation. And Nora Dalton developed an unexplained habit of riding out to Elias Croft's ranch with fresh-baked pie, strong coffee, and reasons to let the afternoon stretch longer than she'd originally planned. There's something worth noticing about that. Sometimes the finest things in life don't arrive polished and effortless. Sometimes they show up trail-worn and limping, carrying more history than pride, smelling like wood smoke and old leather. And maybe that's precisely why they hold. Some mornings after that summer, Elias moved a little slower than the season before, but Nora never seemed to be in any particular hurry. Now, before we close out this Wyoming story tonight, I want to be straightforward with you. This tale was drawn from classic frontier storytelling traditions and older Western-style narratives, shaped and expanded with added emotion, character, and detail to give it new life for this format. The visuals throughout this video were crafted with AI tools to capture the spirit and atmosphere of the old frontier. And if this style of storytelling isn't quite what you came looking for, that's completely all right. Different campfires burn for different folks. But if something in this story sat with you tonight, drop a comment below and tell me what it was. Those responses genuinely help me find more forgotten stories worth dusting off and sharing. And if tales about quiet courage, ordinary loyalty, and people who do right when it costs them something still mean something to you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because if you ask me, the world could stand to meet a few more people like Elias Croft. One last question before you go tonight. If you'd been standing in that dusty Laramie street at sunrise, watching everything unfold, would you have put your faith in the old rancher with the worn-out eyes, or the man with the shining badge?